Hello Midnights. We hope you enjoy our stories. Next one, Beyond Gypsy Stereotypes, Understanding the Romani People. Don't forget to subscribe. The people often referred to as Gypsies are more accurately and respectfully known as Romani. The term Gypsy itself is frequently considered offensive, stemming from its historical negative connotations and the mistaken belief that they originated from Egypt. Romani people represent a diverse group with a rich and intricate history, often profoundly misunderstood and subjected to unfair treatment. While there's no single, unified Romani religion, Romani people have historically adopted the dominant faiths of the countries they reside in, often blending these with unique spiritual practices and beliefs. This adaptive approach has led to Romani communities identifying as Christians, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Muslims, or, less commonly, followers of other faiths, all while retaining a distinct spiritual outlook centered on concepts like Romanipan, the Romani code of conduct and purity, respect for elders, and a strong sense of community. Their beliefs often emphasize fate, luck, and an inherent connection to the spiritual world, sometimes incorporating traditional practices like ancestor veneration or specific rituals for protection and healing. Their origins, extensive migrations, and the myths and folklore often linked to them are deeply intertwined with their distinctive way of life and their long-standing interactions with settled communities across centuries. Ancient origins and expansive journeys. Evidence strongly indicates that the Romani people originated in the Indian subcontinent, specifically from regions in what is now northern India, including areas like Rajasthan and Punjab. This ancestry is robustly supported by their language, Romani, an Indo-Aryan tongue showing clear ties to ancient Sanskrit and modern Indian languages such as Hindi and Punjabi. Genetic studies further corroborate their South Asian lineage, identifying unique genetic markers consistent with migration patterns from that region. Their journey westward from India began in successive waves, likely commencing around the 10th or 11th century CE. These migrations weren't a single, planned exodus but rather a gradual dispersion driven by various factors, potentially including economic pressures, military conflicts, or perhaps the continuation of an already established nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle within India. These early groups traversed immense distances, moving through what was ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, Armenia, and the vast Byzantine Empire, encompassing parts of modern-day Turkey and Greece. During their significant period in the Byzantine Empire, the Romani language absorbed a rich tapestry of loanwords from Persian, Armenian, and especially Greek, reflecting prolonged cultural exchange. From the Byzantine lands, the Romani diaspora expanded into Europe, reaching the Balkans by the 14th century and extending into Western Europe by the 15th century. Their arrival in different European countries was often met with fleeting initial curiosity, swiftly replaced by deep suspicion and, tragically, widespread and sustained persecution. They were consistently perceived as outsiders, individuals without ancestral lands who didn't readily integrate into the established social, religious, and economic frameworks of medieval and early modern European societies. Demographics and distribution today. Currently, the Romani people are recognized as Europe's largest ethnic minority, with estimated populations ranging from 10 to 12 million across the continent. However, obtaining precise figures remains challenging due to historical persecution, a lack of official recognition and data collection in some areas, and the understandable reluctance of some Romani individuals to self-identify in national censuses for fear of discrimination. While dispersed globally, their largest concentrations are found in southeastern Europe, particularly in countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, and Slovakia. Substantial and long-established Romani communities also thrive in Spain, for example, the Roma of Andalusia, often known as Gitanos, France, Italy, and Germany, among others. Beyond Europe, Romani communities have established themselves in North and South America, including notable populations in the United States, Canada, and Brazil, and even Australia, underscoring the vast and enduring nature of their global dispersal over many centuries. The mystique of magic and myth. The pervasive association of Romani people with magic, fortune-telling, and various myths is a multifaceted phenomenon. It stems from a complex interplay of their distinct cultural practices, the anxieties and projections of the settled populations they encountered, and a historical scarcity of accurate information about their true background. This convergence of the unfamiliar, the exotic, and the practical necessity of survival within often hostile environments largely propelled the Romani into the mystical realm in the eyes of others. This solidified a perception of their powers that were more a product of popular imagination and deep-seated societal fears than any actual supernatural ability. This journey into the realm of the mystical began almost immediately upon their initial arrival in Europe, propelled by the stark cultural differences they presented and the inherent human tendency to attribute unusual or unexplained phenomena to unknown or supernatural forces. The most prominent link to magic stems from the public and highly visible practice of fortune-telling, a profession widely adopted by many Romani individuals. It became a crucial and pragmatic means of livelihood, particularly for Romani women, who would engage in various forms of divination such as palm reading, tarot card interpretation, scrying, looking into reflective surfaces like crystals or water, and other predictive arts. These services were offered to a non-Romani populace frequently eager for glimpses into their future, solutions to personal dilemmas, or insights into matters of love, finance, and health. Within some Romani communities, there were indeed traditions of interpreting signs, dreams, and natural phenomena, reflecting a spiritual outlook that might have been less formally structured or dogmatic than mainstream religions. This cultural openness to unseen forces, omens, and symbolic interpretation could have naturally contributed to the development of divinatory practices, which were often seen internally as ways to understand life's unpredictable currents, gain insight into human nature, or even offer psychological comfort and guidance. However, for settled Europeans, who found Romani people inherently mysterious due to their distinct customs, nomadic existence, and foreign language, these divinatory practices were readily misinterpreted as genuine magical abilities. The Romani's perceived capacity to foretell the future or reveal hidden truths sparked both intense fascination and deep-seated fear. This power was frequently attributed to an innate, almost supernatural insight, rather than skillful observation of human behavior. Keen deduction based on subtle cues, such as clothing, demeanor, body language, or direct questions, or clever cold reading techniques where general statements are interpreted as highly specific by the individual. Crucially, clients' pre-existing beliefs, anxieties, and the psychological impact of having their hopes or fears articulated often made the readings seem uncannily accurate, thereby reinforcing the myth in a self-fulfilling prophecy. For instance, a Romani woman might tell a client of impending travel or a new romantic entanglement, observations that could be generalized enough to resonate with many, yet feel profoundly personal and revelatory to the individual. Contributing factors to mystical perceptions. The Romani's nomadic lifestyle, their often colorful and distinctive attire, vibrant music, and unique language all contributed significantly to an aura of mystery and exoticism. In the absence of detailed knowledge about their true culture and history, many non-Romani people filled this informational void with their own conjectures and stereotypes. Their very presence, often appearing seemingly from nowhere and vanishing just as swiftly, imbued them with an almost otherworldly quality, as if they possessed the ability to materialize and dematerialize at will. This transience, which was alien to the largely rooted, agrarian societies of Europe, simultaneously bred both wonder and suspicion. A particularly pervasive and enduring myth, which emerged early in their European sojourn, from the 15th century onwards, was the notion that the Romani originated from ancient Egypt. This idea, sometimes put forth by the Romani themselves in early interactions with European authorities, perhaps to gain acceptance, to leverage a connection to a revered ancient civilization, or simply to explain their foreignness in a way that resonated with their hosts, directly led to the widespread use of the term Gypsy, which is a corruption of Egyptian. Ancient Egypt was already deeply associated in the European mind with esoteric knowledge, mummies, ancient curses, and profound mystical practices, thus lending a further, powerful layer of magic to these supposed Egyptians. Their distinct physical appearance, often perceived as darker than many Europeans, their sometimes elaborate attire, and their rich musical traditions, featuring instruments and melodies unfamiliar to European ears, such as the haunting tones of the violin or dulcimer playing exotic scales, further contributed to a sense of them being otherworldly or possessing secret, ancient knowledge. This perception was frequently amplified and solidified by exaggerated literary portrayals in prominent fictional works, where Romani characters are depicted with an inherent mystical allure, an almost supernatural intuition, and an innate connection to the arcane, sometimes even with the ability to charm animals or cast compelling spells through their mesmerizing artistry. Like many groups living in close proximity to nature and outside formal medical systems, some Romani communities possessed extensive knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional medicine. This practical wisdom, often passed down orally through generations, could be perceived by outsiders as a form of magic or witchcraft, especially if the remedies proved effective in ways not understood by the conventional medicine of the time. Romani herbalists, renowned for their deep understanding of local flora and their medicinal properties, often gathered specific plants under certain lunar phases or at dawn, observing rituals that only added to the mystique surrounding their craft. The success of their remedies, particularly when mainstream medicine failed, led to the widespread belief that they possessed potent healing powers or access to ancient, forgotten cures. For example, a severe cough or a persistent skin ailment might be cured by a Romani herbalist's concoction after local physicians failed, leading to exaggerated tales of miraculous healing and almost magical cures. Conversely, and far more dangerously, the popular belief also emerged that Romani individuals could inflict harm through curses or hexes. This profound fear was often stoked by the inability of settled communities to comprehend or control Romani people. An angry word, a perceived slight, or an unexplained misfortune in a local community, such as a lost harvest, sudden illness in livestock, or personal tragedy, could easily lead to anxiety and the conviction that one had been cursed by a Romani individual. These fears frequently led to accusations and violent retaliation. Conversely, Romani people were also sought out for blessings, protective charms, like amulets or specific rituals, or to ward off evil, with the belief that they held the power to influence luck and destiny, often through the potent psychological effects of suggestion and fear. A farmer worried about his crops might seek a Romani blessing, and if the harvest was good, it would be attributed to the Romani's power, regardless of other contributing factors like weather or soil quality. Centuries of persecution. Throughout history, the Romani people have faced intense prejudice and discrimination, leading to centuries of widespread, systemic persecution that has been a relentless reality across Europe, intensifying at various points. This persecution arose from several deeply intertwined factors, fundamentally rooted in xenophobia and a profound lack of understanding. Their perceived otherness, as a distinct ethnic group with their own language, customs, and frequently a nomadic lifestyle, led them to be seen as perpetual outsiders who did not conform to the established social, legal, and religious norms of European societies. This divergence bred profound suspicion and fear among the settled populations. Economic competition and resentment also played a significant role. Romani people often worked as skilled artisans, particularly in metalworking, basket weaving, and tool sharpening, entertainers, musicians, dancers, and traders. Their mobile nature meant they were not bound by local guilds, feudal systems, or land ownership, which was often perceived as an economic threat or an evasion of established order by local authorities and competing tradespeople. Religious differences were another critical factor. While initially some Romani were welcomed as pilgrims, as they traversed diverse regions and maintained their unique spiritual traditions that often blended elements from various faiths, they were increasingly accused of being heathens, spies, for example, for opposing empires during periods of conflict, or even in league with malevolent forces. Furthermore, their nomadism was viewed as a direct threat to state control as European nations consolidated power, hindering efforts at centralized administration, taxation, and military conscription, which inevitably led to increasingly harsh laws designed to force them to settle. Above all, Romani people were frequent targets of scapegoating and baseless accusations. In times of social unrest, widespread disease, like epidemics of plague or cholera, or economic hardship, they became convenient targets, facing common accusations of witchcraft, child abduction, a particularly insidious and persistent libel, often used to justify violence against communities and instill fear, poisoning of wells, especially during outbreaks of disease, and theft. These claims were overwhelmingly unfounded and often echoed similar slanders used against other marginalized groups throughout history. The pervasive fear of Romani people stems from a complex confluence of historical, social, and psychological factors. Upon their initial arrival in Europe, Romani people were profoundly different in appearance, language, and customs from the settled populations. This inherent otherness automatically bred suspicion and fear. Humans tend to be wary of what they do not understand, and the Romani's perceived mysterious origins and traditions were easily interpreted as sinister or threatening. For centuries, European society was largely agrarian and organized around fixed communities, inherited land ownership, and rigid feudal systems. The Romani's nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle fundamentally challenged these foundational structures. They were seen as rootless, untaxable, uncontrollable, and operating entirely outside the established social order. This inherent lack of fixed abode generated deep-seated fear of their perceived lawlessness and unpredictability. While Romani people offered valuable services as artisans, musicians, and traders, their presence could also be perceived as direct economic competition by local laborers and craftsmen, especially during times of scarcity or economic downturn. Accusations of theft and trickery, though largely unfounded as characteristic of the entire group, often arose from these acute economic tensions. In deeply spiritual and often rigidly religious European societies, the Romani's distinct spiritual practices, Their often tolerant approach to other faiths, and their initial ambiguous religious claims, for example, being penitents or pilgrims from an ancient land, frequently led to accusations of being pagans, non-believers, or even devil worshippers. This moral condemnation made it easier for authorities and the populace to justify their marginalization and cruelty towards them. As detailed previously, the Romanis' engagement in fortune-telling and herbalism, combined with the exoticism of their culture, led to widespread beliefs in their magical powers, both benevolent and malevolent. While some individuals sought out their gifts for good fortune or healing, many more feared their supposed ability to cast curses, bewitch others, or malevolently influence fate, contributing to a climate of superstitious terror. In times of severe crisis, such as famine, widespread plague, or social unrest, Romani people, as readily identifiable outsiders, became convenient scapegoats. Accusations of spreading disease, kidnapping children, a libel that persists in some places even today, or causing general misfortune were frequently leveled against them, effectively diverting blame from actual causes and uniting the settled population against a common, manufactured enemy. These deeply ingrained historical fears, deeply embedded in European folklore, literature, and institutions, laid the groundwork for centuries of systemic oppression. A brutal timeline of persecution. The timeline of persecution is extensive and brutally documented. In early modern Europe, from the 15th century onward, shortly after their initial widespread appearance, draconian anti-Romani laws began to emerge across the continent. For instance, in the late 15th century, a major European empire issued an edict for their expulsion, followed by similar decrees in other prominent European nations such as England, France, and Spain, often making their mere presence illegal and punishable by death. A particularly stark event in the mid-18th century, in a major European country, saw thousands of Romani individuals imprisoned indiscriminately, with women and children forcibly separated from men, in a horrific and ultimately failed attempt to exterminate them as a distinct ethnic group through forced assimilation and biological elimination. In parts of Eastern Europe, most notably in regions now corresponding to modern-day Romania, Romani people were subjected to brutal hereditary slavery for approximately 5 centuries, from the 14th until their formal emancipation in the mid-19th century, 1856 to 1864. During this period, they were treated as mere chattel, bought, sold, traded, and given as gifts, and their children were born directly into slavery. Owners had absolute rights over their slaves, short of summary execution, though brutal punishments, including torture and mutilation, were common. Other decrees across the continent ordered their summary execution without trial, forced settlement in designated areas, or the forcible removal of children for assimilation, actions that constituted cultural genocide aimed at eradicating Romani identity. For instance, in the early 18th century, an influential European monarch issued a decree stating that adult Romani males caught in his territory should be hanged without trial, while women and children were to be flogged and banished. Another powerful empress of the same era introduced policies that prohibited Romani individuals from marrying among themselves, forced them to abandon their nomadic lifestyle, and notoriously, forcibly removed Romani children from their families to be raised by non-Romani families, a policy explicitly aimed at obliterating Romani identity and culture from the next generation. Even into the 19th and early 20th centuries, systemic discrimination continued despite the Enlightenment's ideals of human rights and equality. Many countries enacted discriminatory laws restricting their movement, employment opportunities, and access to education, effectively creating a marginalized underclass. Pseudo-scientific racial theories gained dangerous traction during this period, wrongly labeling Romani people as asocial, degenerate, or racially inferior, paving the way for further atrocities and dehumanization. Police agencies in certain nations began compiling detailed registries of Romani individuals, documenting their movements, family ties, and personal characteristics, a bureaucratic framework that laid the groundwork for the ultimate horror of the Holocaust. The Porajmos, the Romani Holocaust. The horrific culmination of centuries of prejudice occurred during the Porajmos, meaning the devouring or the great swallowing in Romani, signifying the Romani Holocaust, from the 1930s to 1945s. Under the National Socialist regime in Germany and its collaborators across occupied Europe, Romani people, like other persecuted groups such as Jews, were deemed racially undesirable and targeted for systematic persecution, forced sterilization, internment in concentration camps, and mass murder. The regime considered them race aliens and asocials, categorizing them for extermination as part of their broader genocidal agenda. From the early 1930s, Romani people in the German sphere faced escalating discrimination, forced registration with authorities, arbitrary arrests, forced labor in deplorable conditions, denial of citizenship, for example, through the extension of certain race laws that stripped them of their rights, and compulsory sterilization. For example, between the mid-1930s and 1940s, thousands of Romani individuals, both men and women, were forcibly sterilized, often without anesthetic, as part of the regime's brutal racial hygiene policies aimed at preventing their reproduction. Romani communities were systematically rounded up and confined to special segregated camps within cities, which served as temporary holding facilities and precursors to larger deportations to extermination sites. In May 1940, over 2,300 Romani were deported from parts of Germany to an occupied territory in Eastern Europe, specifically the Generalgouvernement, German-occupied Poland, where most perished due to brutal conditions, starvation, and disease. In autumn 1941, over 5,000 Romani from an occupied Central European nation were deported to a major ghetto in an occupied city, where hundreds died from disease and starvation before the survivors were later transferred to extermination facilities. A significant decree issued in December 1942 by a high-ranking Nazi official ordered the deportation of all Romani from the Greater Germanic Reich to a specific Gypsy family camp within the notorious Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp. Approximately 23,000 Romani people were deported to this camp, and an estimated 20,000 to 21,000 of them were murdered there, predominantly in the gas chambers. The family camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau was brutally liquidated on August 2, 1944, when thousands of the remaining Romani prisoners were gassed after a courageous, albeit ultimately futile, resistance against the camp guards. This date is now widely commemorated as European Roma Holocaust Memorial Day. In German-occupied Eastern Europe and the Balkans, particularly in territories of the Soviet Union and parts of Yugoslavia, Romani people were murdered en masse by German security forces and their local collaborators, often alongside Jewish victims and partisans, through systematic mass shootings in forests and ravines. In one Balkan nation alone, thousands of Romani were killed. For instance, in August 1942, a German official reported that a specific region had solved the Jewish question and the Gypsy question, indicating a complete extermination. Local collaborationist regimes also played a significant role in the genocide. In a certain independent state established by the Axis powers, the ruling ultranationalist regime virtually annihilated its Romani population, with estimates suggesting around 25,000 to 26,000 Romani were killed or deported to horrific concentration camps where they faced unimaginable brutality. In another Eastern European nation, the wartime government deported approximately 25,000 Romani to an occupied territory, where around 11,000, 44%, perished due to starvation, disease, lack of shelter, and exposure. The exact number of Romani victims in the Porajmos is exceedingly difficult to ascertain due to the decentralized nature of the killings, the deliberate destruction of records by the perpetrators, and the continued marginalization and lack of recognition of Romani communities even after the war. However, current historical estimates for the total number of Romani lives taken by the National Socialists and their collaborators during the Second World War range from 250,000 to 500,000. Some researchers even suggest figures as high as 1.5 million out of an estimated pre-war European Romani population of 1 million to 2 million, indicating that 25% to over 50% of the European Romani population was annihilated. This makes the Porajmos a systematic genocide on a scale comparable to other Nazi atrocities, and it remains a largely overlooked and under-recognized chapter of the Holocaust. Ongoing struggles and persistent stereotypes. In the period spanning post-World War II to the present day, discrimination against Romani people has regrettably continued, often manifesting in new forms. Many Romani survivors received no reparations or recognition as victims of Nazi persecution for decades after the war. One major Western European nation only officially recognized the Nazi persecution of Romani as racially motivated in the early 1980s, and a significant memorial to Romani victims was only opened in its capital in the early 2010s. In communist regimes across Eastern Europe, forced assimilation policies were common, often involving forced settlement in state-assigned housing and the suppression of Romani language and culture through education and media controls. Shockingly, instances of forced sterilization of Romani women persisted into the late 20th and even early 21st centuries in some European countries, a chilling echo of the Nazi era. Today, Romani communities across Europe still face severe challenges, including forced evictions from informal settlements, systemic housing segregation in impoverished ghettos, widespread discrimination in employment, leading to high unemployment rates, and education, resulting in lower educational attainment, pervasive police brutality, and frequent hate crimes. The vast majority of accusations levied against Romani people throughout history, such as widespread criminality or inherent laziness, were baseless fabrications driven by prejudice and a desire to justify their marginalization and exploitation. While individual Romani, like any other group, may have engaged in minor offenses out of economic desperation or due to systemic barriers to legitimate work, these were never characteristic of the entire population. The truth lies not in their alleged guilt, but in the pervasive anti-Ciganism, a specific, deeply entrenched form of racism against Romani people, that has historically sought to dehumanize them and deny them basic human rights. Perhaps one of the most damaging mythical stories used against the Romani is the idea that they are cursed to wander the earth, never finding a permanent home. This myth often claims they were punished for supposedly refusing hospitality to a specific religious figure during a historical journey, or for an alleged role in forging items for a pivotal religious event. This narrative attempts to provide a divine justification for their nomadic lifestyle and their subsequent ill treatment, transforming their forced displacement and persecution into a righteous punishment. Such stories found fertile ground in medieval and early modern Europe, where religious narratives heavily influenced societal perceptions and social control. In stark contrast to these external myths, Romani oral traditions contain rich folklore, often focusing on their resilience, wisdom, and profound connection to nature. One common Romani creation narrative suggests that after creating all other peoples, a higher power made the Romani last, but bestowed upon them a special gift, the ability to adapt and survive anywhere, embodying a spirit of freedom and artistry, rather than a curse of eternal wandering. This internal narrative stands in stark opposition to the oppressive myths imposed from outside. Finally, some Romani individuals developed exceptional skills in persuasive communication and charming interactions, which were often necessary for survival in environments where they faced hostility and needed to navigate complex social dynamics. This ability to influence others, combined with their fortune-telling practices, could be easily misconstrued as a form of charm or even mind control by superstitious observers. This perception often fed into the stereotype of the cunning Romani, further linking them to a mystical, almost manipulative, power. The stolen glances or whispered words were often interpreted as spells or enchantments, rather than simply skillful interpersonal engagement and reading of social cues. Gendered perceptions of magic. The stereotypes and perceived powers associated with Romani individuals have historically been highly gendered, reflecting both actual roles within Romani culture and the external projections of non-Romani societies. Romani women were overwhelmingly the figures associated with overt magic and divination in popular imagination. This stems from their traditional role in interacting with the non-Romani, Gaj, world for economic purposes, especially through highly visible practices like fortune-telling, palmistry, and herbalism. These roles allowed them direct engagement with the wider population and provided a crucial income source that could be performed while traveling with minimal equipment. Consequently, the popular image of the mystical Romani with a crystal ball, tarot cards, or reading palms is almost exclusively feminine. Non-Romani folklore, literature, and even opera often depicted Romani women as possessing an inherent, alluring, and sometimes dangerous magical quality, tied to their perceived exoticism, independence, and sensuality. This power was frequently linked to intuition, ancient secrets, and a connection to primal forces. In contrast, while Romani men were not typically associated with fortune-telling or overt magical practices, they were linked to other skills and professions that, in a superstitious context, could also take on a magical aura, though less directly so. Traditionally, Romani men excelled as highly skilled artisans like metal workers, blacksmiths, tinsmiths, coppersmiths, horse dealers, animal trainers, and musicians. Their metalworking skills, involving the mastery of fire and the seemingly alchemical transformation of raw materials into useful objects, might have appeared almost supernatural to untrained observers in pre-industrial societies. Their profound understanding of animals, particularly horses, could be misinterpreted as an almost telepathic ability to control or communicate with creatures, leading to popular tales of horse-whispering powers. Romani male musicians, celebrated for their virtuosity, improvisational skill, and emotional depth on instruments like the violin, clarinet, or guitar, could be seen as possessing a captivating power to evoke deep emotions and enthrall audiences with their music, sometimes so moving it was believed to be enchanted or inspired by unseen forces. While these were fundamentally practical skills and artistic talents, the lack of understanding from outsiders, combined with existing prejudices, could infuse them with an element of the supernatural. Within some Romani communities, men might engage in spiritual practices related to upholding Romanipin or community leadership, but these were typically internal and not presented as magic to outsiders. Thus, the perceived powers of Romani women often centered on divination, healing, and interpersonal influence, while for men, it leaned towards mastery of specific crafts, the perceived ability to control animals, or command attention and emotion through compelling performance. Dispelling myths for a just future. The association of Romani people with magic and myths is a complex tapestry woven from their genuine cultural practices, the economic necessities of their nomadic life, and the projections, fears, and profound misunderstandings of the settled societies they encountered. While Romani culture does hold deep spiritual traditions, a rich oral history, and traditional knowledge of healing, the widespread image of them as inherently magical beings or sorcerers is largely a product of external perceptions, fueled by historical prejudice, exoticism, and a persistent lack of accurate information. The powers attributed to them are, in reality, a testament to the power of human belief, fear, and prejudice, rather than any verifiable supernatural ability. Understanding the true origins and complex history of the Romani people is crucial to dispelling these persistent myths and harmful stereotypes. It allows for a profound appreciation of their vibrant culture, their remarkable resilience in the face of centuries of often brutal persecution, and the recognition that their true magic lies not in supernatural powers, but in their enduring spirit, their rich artistic traditions, and their profound ability to adapt and navigate a world that has, for far too long, been hostile to their very existence. Moving beyond the fantastical imagery and confronting the difficult and often painful history of their persecution is an essential step for fostering a more respectful, accurate, and empathetic understanding of a people whose story is as compelling and complex as any myth, and whose ongoing struggles demand recognition, justice, and inclusion. The enduring stereotypes not only misrepresent their culture but also actively contribute to the ongoing discrimination and marginalization they face today. Challenging these deeply ingrained preconceived notions is a vital step toward creating a more inclusive and equitable society for the Romani people globally.